The ceaseless thrum of my instruments was the only lullaby I knew. A metallic hum that sang of distant light years and the silent, hungry void between them. My sanctuary, a low-slung concrete structure, clung to the cliff face, half buried in the earth, its dish a silver eye perpetually scanning the heavens. Below, the ocean gnawed at the base of the land, carving out the ancient, echoing maw of the coastal caves. Their dark mouths, perpetually tasting salt and shadow, mirrored the cosmic abysses I sought to fathom. For years, this routine had been my anchor, my singular purpose. Each morning, the first pale smear of dawn would find me hunched over glowing displays, a mug of lukewarm coffee a forgotten sentinel beside my elbow. My days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting patterns of celestial bodies and the subtle rhythmic pulse of my own determined heart. The world beyond my observatory felt distant, a faint echo of human clamor I had long since chosen to ignore. Its concerns were fleeting, its dramas inconsequential against the backdrop of eternity. My current obsession, a faint, almost imperceptible wobble in the rotation of a neutron star nearly 1,000 light-years away, demanded my full, unblinking attention. It was a subtle anomaly, one that most would dismiss as instrumentation error or cosmic noise. I adjusted the spectral filters, my fingers dancing across the console's cool surface, the air thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. The data streamed across my main monitor, a cascade of numbers and graphs, each point a silent testament to the universe's elegant, brutal laws. Then it came. Not a wobble, not a faint tremor, but a rupture. The primary display flickered, then resolved into a pattern that seized my breath in my throat. It wasn't the expected spectral signature, nor any known form of electromagnetic radiation. This was impossible. The waveform was a fractal nightmare, self-similar to an infinite degree, yet utterly alien in its composition. It defied every principle of physics I had ever known, every established law of propagation and frequency. It was a signal, undeniably, but one that seemed woven from the fabric of contradiction itself. My hand, poised over a control, froze. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a fundamental blasphemy against the cosmic order. The signal pulsed, a silent, rhythmic beat, yet its rhythm seemed to shift, to subtly alter its own internal logic with each cycle. It felt less like a transmission and more like a living, breathing paradox. I ran the diagnostic protocols, my movements stiff, almost robotic. Every sensor, every antenna array, every calibration check came back clean. The equipment was functioning flawlessly. The signal was real. My internal chronometer registered the passage of minutes, then an hour, but time had become a meaningless construct. My world had narrowed to the glowing screen, the impossible pattern, and the frantic, almost desperate scramble of my mind to comprehend what I was seeing. The signal's source, according to my triangulation, originated from a region of space utterly devoid of anything known to science, beyond the furthest reaches of the observable universe, a place where theoretical physics gave way to philosophical speculation. It was coming from beyond. The sheer audacity of that thought sent a shiver through me, a primal recognition of something vast and utterly indifferent. I tried to isolate its component frequencies, to break it down, to find a Rosetta Stone within its unfathomable complexity. Each attempt was met with the same unsettling result. The signal seemed to reconfigure itself, subtly shifting its characteristics, as if mocking my efforts. It was like trying to grasp smoke or to hold a dream in my waking hand. A strange, almost imperceptible pressure began to build behind my eyes. A faint hum that wasn't from the equipment, but seemed to resonate within my own skull. The air in the observatory, usually dry and sterile, suddenly felt thick, almost viscous, as if the very atmosphere was changing, becoming heavier, imbued with an unseen presence. The waves crashed against the rocks with a new, unsettling ferocity, their roar seeming to echo the impossible rhythm of the signal. Had they always sounded so hungry? This wasn't merely data. It felt like an intrusion. It was a mirror reflecting a universe I didn't recognize. A universe where the laws I had dedicated my life to understanding were mere suggestions, easily rewritten by something vast and ancient. The universe, I realized with a sickening lurch, had just shown me its teeth. For 3 days, that hum had been overlaid by a new, impossible resonance, the signal. I hunched over the main console, the cool plastic of the keyboard a faint anchor in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. The screens before me glowed with patterns that defied every known principle of physics. I had cross-referenced, recalibrated, even manually inspected the dish for anomalies, but the data remained immutable, an unblinking crystalline truth. It wasn't merely complex, it was wrong. Recursive structures folded in on themselves without end. Geometries that twisted into dimensions my mind could only graze, like a blind man tracing the edge of a hypercube. Lines on the spectral analysis graph would converge at points that then simultaneously diverged, creating a visual paradox that made my eyes ache. A particular waveform, an undulating, pulsing pattern, seemed to possess a strange, self-referential logic. A loop that described its own description, an echo of an echo. My voice sounded alien, thin, as if it had to push through a layer of static that only I could perceive. A flicker at the edge of my vision. I snapped my head up. Nothing. Just the bare concrete wall, scarred by years of sea spray and wind. But for a split second, the corner of the room had seemed to stretch, pulling away from itself, like wet paper distorting. My breath hitched. I rubbed my eyes, the grit of sleeplessness a dull abrasion. It was exhaustion, I told myself, the relentless grind of intellectual pursuit blurring the edges of reality. I turned back to the console, forcing my focus. The impossible waveform pulsed. And then, within its silent undulation, I heard it. A whisper. It was formless, without language, yet it carried an intimation of vastness, of something ancient and utterly indifferent. My scalp prickled. I clenched my jaw, trying to rationalize it away. The hum of the cooling fans, the oceanic roar beyond the thick walls, my mind playing tricks. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to flee, to escape the sterile confines of my data-filled sanctuary. I needed air, the raw, unmediated expanse of the coast. Slamming a hand on the console, I pushed back from the desk, the chair scraping loudly on the concrete floor. I grabbed my old canvas jacket, the salt-stained fabric a familiar comfort against my skin, and stumbled out into the twilight. The wind was a living thing, tearing at my clothes, whipping my hair across my face. It was a relief, a cleansing force against the insidious invasion of my senses. The air, sharp with brine, filled my lungs, momentarily clearing the fog in my skull. My feet, guided by instinct, led me to the coastal caves. The entrance was a narrow fissure, slick with algae, opening into a vast, echoing chamber. Then, a glint. Deep within the cave, where no light should reach, a pinpoint of impossible luminescence. It was not a reflection, not the glint of water. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The light pulsed, faint but undeniable, a silent beat in the cavern's maw. It was still formless, still without language, but it felt closer now, more insistent, a soft rustling of cosmic leaves. My vision blurred. The impossible. For 3 days, I had barely left the console, the taste of stale coffee and desperation a constant companion on my tongue. The world outside, with its mundane sun and predictable tides, had receded into a distant, irrelevant hum. It was a colleague, his digital avatar a familiar, concerned face. He probably wanted to discuss the overdue report on stellar drift, or perhaps the curious anomaly in the Andromeda data. I swiped it away with a dismissive flick of my wrist, the gesture feeling heavy, as if my arm were made of lead. Such earthly concerns felt like whispers from a child's dream, utterly inconsequential beside the roaring silence of it. Empty nutrient paste packets littered the floor, alongside discarded thermal wraps. I barely recognized the man staring back, nor did I care to. He was merely the vessel, the temporary shell housing the burgeoning comprehension. The signal, once a mere pattern of frequencies, had begun to bloom. It wasn't just data anymore. It was an unfolding tapestry woven from unseen light and unheard sound. My processing units, pushed far beyond their theoretical limits, hummed with a frantic energy, spitting out visual representations that defied Euclidean geometry. On the main display, a vast shifting mosaic pulsed. Lines bent into impossible angles, colors bled into one another, creating hues that had no names in my spectrum. It was a landscape of pure thought, a cathedral of concepts. I saw structures that were simultaneously inside and outside, forms that implied infinite dimensions twisting back upon themselves. My mind, a delicate instrument tuned for the linear and the logical, struggled to contain the influx. My temples throbbed with a dull ache that seemed to emanate from within my very skull. Then, a new layer began to overlay the geometric chaos. It wasn't an image I could fully grasp, but a sensation, a presence. It was the way a storm cloud perceives a single raindrop, or a mountain views a grain of sand. Insignificant, fleeting. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the very bedrock of my sanctuary. A deep note that resonated not in my ears, but in my bones. It was a call, subtle yet irresistible, emanating from the earth beneath my feet. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed all reason, that it was drawing me deeper. The signal wasn't just here in my instruments, it was everywhere. I found myself moving, a puppet on strings I couldn't see, towards the back of the concrete structure. A heavy, reinforced door, usually sealed tight against the elements, stood ajar. Beyond it, the air grew damp and cool, carrying the saline scent of the ocean and the earthy musk of ancient rock. The entrance to the coastal caves. I had explored them once, years ago, when the world still held its predictable edges. Now they beckoned like a maw. My flashlight beam cut a wavering path through the gloom, revealing glistening stalactites and the slow drip of water. The signal here was not just a visual or oral phenomenon. It was a tactile presence. I felt the slow, deliberate pulse of something immense, something truly alien, resonating through the very stone. Deep within the coastal caves, where the ocean's roar was a muffled sigh and the only light came from my failing torch, the communication became direct. It bypassed my senses entirely, plunging concepts directly into the core of my being. There were no words, no images, only pure understanding. I knew, suddenly and irrevocably, what humanity was to it. Not a threat, not a challenge, not even a curiosity. We were merely a fleeting ripple on an unimaginable ocean, a brief, phosphorescent bloom that would fade without notice. A dream, perhaps, dreamt by something too vast to care for its own fleeting thoughts. Or worse, a nascent, unacknowledged meal, slowly ripening in the universal current, its eventual consumption as inevitable and unremarkable as the turning of a tide. The revelation was not terrifying in its brutality, but in its utter indifference. My logic, once my shield and sword, splintered under the weight of this cosmic apathy. And we, all of us, were simply on the menu. It no longer sang of distant light years, but whispered of something closer, something inside the very fabric of my being, tearing it apart. The signal, that impossible tremor from beyond the known, had ceased to be a mere scientific curiosity. It was a language, yes, but a language spoken by something that didn't merely observe. It permeated. My established models, my elegant equations, They shattered against the signal's relentless, unfathomable patterns. It defied every constant, every law I held sacred. The data streams, once pristine, now seemed to shimmer with an internal, malevolent logic. My intellect, my pride, demanded an answer, but the universe I knew offered none. I needed to look elsewhere, beyond the rigid confines of accepted physics. There had to be a precedent, a shadow of recognition in the collective unconscious. Days blurred into a single aching vigil. My eyes, gritty and raw, devoured crumbling digital texts that spoke of cycles of oblivion, of entities that predate starlight. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a ghostly echo within the noise. No, I rasped, my voice a dry rustle in the quiet lab. I saw it then, in the periphery of my vision. A flicker, a shift in the geometric precision of the monitor's bezel. For a breath, the straight line seemed to curve, to ripple like water. I blinked, and it was gone. I unearthed accounts of a great sleeper, an indifferent consciousness that dreamt reality into being, and whose awakening meant the dissolution of all that was. The signal wasn't just information. It was the echo of that vastness, seeping into my world. My sanity, a fragile construct at the best of times, began to fray. The hum of the instruments no longer merely thrummed. It seemed to breathe. I would catch glimpses of impossible geometry in the reflections on the glass of my screens. Structures that defied Euclidean space, twisting into themselves. When I turned my head, they vanished, leaving only the mundane, reassuring straight lines. But the memory of their impossible form lingered, a burning afterimage on my mind's eye. The pull grew stronger, an inexplicable yearning that resonated with a passage I'd found in a particularly unsettling tome. When the great sleeper stirs, its dreams manifest in the oldest places where the earth remembers. My gaze drifted to the window, to the turbulent expanse of the sea and the jagged maw of the coastal caves below. They were ancient, silent witnesses to countless tides. The signal wasn't just transmitting data. It was a key, unlocking something dormant within the world, and perhaps within me. I gathered my equipment, a powerful lantern and a rugged tablet, my movements stiff, as if my limbs were no longer entirely my own. The sound of the crashing waves intensified, a primal roar that swallowed all other noise. My lantern beam pierced the gloom, revealing slick, algae-covered rock walls, dripping with an unseen moisture. I pressed deeper, the rock pressing in around me, a silent, unblinking witness. Not a grand revelation, not an overt sign, but something far more insidious. On a stretch of damp, smooth rock, high above the reach of the highest tide, were faint etchings. They weren't crude, primitive drawings of men or beasts. They were geometric patterns, intricate and alien, yet eerily familiar. The same inverted spiral, repeated, intertwined with other impossible angles, forms that seemed to shift and reconfigure themselves even as I stared. They were the patterns of the signal, carved by hands long dust, or perhaps by something else entirely. The coastal caves were not just ancient, they were aware. It pulsed, a silent, hungry beat. My mind reeled. The myths were not metaphors. The texts were not fiction. They were warnings, echoes across millennia, and I, in my hubris, had stumbled upon the very thing they sought to bury. I couldn't tell. My breath hitched, a cold tremor tracing my spine. When I looked again, the bezel was straight, pristine, mocking my sudden unease. It was fatigue, I told myself. The relentless grind of endless nights spent hunched over data streams, chasing ghosts in the static. Yet the unease clung to me, a damp shroud. I turned back to the main display, where the incomprehensible patterns of the signal swirled in hypnotizing fractal dances. As I stared, a subtle vibration began, not in the floor, but in my very bones. A low hum that resonated with the visual cacophony on screen. The familiar lines of my workbench, usually so solid, seemed to breathe, the edges blurring and sharpening in a rhythm too subtle to grasp fully, too persistent to ignore. The metallic sheen of a forgotten wrench shifted its luster, catching the light in a way that suggested an impossible angle. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the cool steel. It felt solid, yet my mind insisted it had just warped. The hum intensified, a silent pressure behind my eyes. I pushed back from the console, the squeak of my chair a jarring intrusion in the growing quietude. The silence wasn't empty. It was laden, pregnant with unspoken possibility. I felt a profound, primal urge to flee, to escape the suffocating presence that had taken root in my sanctuary. Home offered no solace. The walk from the lab to my apartment was a gauntlet of shifting perspectives. The familiar brickwork of buildings seemed to pulse, their mortar lines wavering like heat haze. I gripped my keys, the cold metal a small anchor in the surging tide of unreality. Inside my apartment, the air was still, heavy. The faint scent of old books and dust, usually comforting, now felt stale, stagnant. The framed photograph of my parents on the mantelpiece, their faces warm with a forgotten smile, seemed to subtly twist, their eyes holding a distant, alien knowing. The pattern on my armchair, a floral motif I'd always found unremarkable, began to writhe, the petals curling inward, then blossoming outward in a grotesque, accelerated cycle. Sleep, when it came, was not a reprieve. Above me, or perhaps within me, an eye bloomed, vast and indifferent, its pupil a swirling galaxy of impossible colors. It didn't see me. It perceived me, not as a being, but as a fleeting thought, a momentary ripple in its own consciousness. I was a dream it was having, and in the dream, I felt myself unraveling, my essence siphoning away, drawn into the impossible vortex of that eye. The horror was not of pain, but of utter erasure. My hands were shaking. I closed my eyes, trying to reorient myself, to grasp the solid contours of reality. When I opened them, the familiar crack in my ceiling, a jagged line I'd meant to patch for months, seemed to have deepened, its edges now perfectly sharp. Too sharp, like a wound carved by an impossibly precise blade. It pulsed faintly, a subtle luminescence emanating from its depths. This wasn't just fatigue. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks. The distortions weren't random. They weren't just visual glitches. They were patterns. The way the light bent, the way the edges of objects softened then sharpened, the specific, impossible angles they adopted. I had seen glimpses of these geometries in the signal data. The incomprehensible equations I had struggled to parse, the non-Euclidean structures hinted at in the signal's deepest layers, were now manifesting in the physical world around me. My reality was not merely shifting, it was being meticulously, monstrously reconstructed. A desperate, irrational thought seized me. Find a place untouched. A place where the signal's influence couldn't reach. A sanctuary outside its encroaching grasp. My mind, racing, fixed on a solitary image. The coastal caves. I had visited them years ago, seeking solitude in the raw, elemental power of the ocean. Perhaps there, amidst the ancient rock and the ceaseless roar of the waves, I could find clarity, an anchor to the world I knew. Driven by an urgency that bordered on madness, I dressed quickly, grabbing my coat and keys. The drive was a blur of distorted streetlights and wavering landscapes. The world outside my car window was a canvas upon which the signal painted its unsettling art. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was a dull, rhythmic thud, a counterpoint to the silent hum that still vibrated in my bones. The beam of my small flashlight cut a narrow path, illuminating the rough-hewn walls. Here, the rock formations, naturally grotesque and ancient, seemed to take on a new, sinister life. The very texture of the stone seemed to breathe, the tiny crystals embedded within glinting with an unnatural brilliance, like a million tiny, indifferent eyes. Then I heard it. It wasn't just in my lab, not just in my home, not just in my mind. It was everywhere. I felt the ancient, indifferent eye from my nightmare open, not in my mind, but in the very air around me, perceiving me, consuming the last vestiges of my sanity. The coastal caves, my desperate sanctuary, were not untouched. They were merely another canvas for the horror, another facet of the world being remade around me, and I was trapped within its unfolding, terrifying design. The straight line of the monitor's bezel, a rigid frontier of my engineered reality, had rippled, a brief shudder like a stone dropped into still water. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only the ghost of its impossible movement in my mind. Yet the air, charged moments before with the scent of ozone and something ancient stirring, still hummed around me, thick and heavy. A metallic tang, like old blood mixed with the static crackle of a forgotten storm, clung to the back of my throat. I blinked, scrubbing at my eyes, the fluorescent glow of the lab feeling too harsh, too insistent. My gaze drifted to the screen, where the impossible signal continued its slow, mesmerizing dance of non-Euclidean geometry. It pulsed now with a different cadence, no longer just a pattern to be decoded, but a presence. A cold dread began to unfurl in my gut. This wasn't just a discovery. It was an invitation, or perhaps an intrusion. The lines of the lab, the familiar angles of my instruments, seemed to waver as if seen through heat haze. My own hand, resting on the console, looked alien for a moment, its skin too porous, its bones too sharp. The whisper intensified, not with words, but with a sudden, overwhelming certainty that bloomed in my mind like a noxious flower. The coast. Not a thought I formed, but a concept implanted, fully formed and undeniable. It bypassed reason, sidestepped logic, and settled in my marrow. A profound magnetic pull towards the ocean, towards the churning chaos where land met endless water. It was an urge so potent it eclipsed all other considerations, a primal hunger that wasn't my own. I moved then, a puppet to an unseen string. My steps felt heavy, yet strangely compelled. The signal, no longer confined to the screen, seemed to resonate with the very landscape, the distant roar of the surf growing louder, more insistent, like a call specifically meant for me. The old pickup truck rattled down the narrow track, its headlights cutting through the clinging fog until the vast, heaving expanse of the ocean revealed itself. The path was treacherous, slick with spray and eroded by countless tides. But I felt no fear, only a strange, almost ecstatic anticipation. My feet seemed to know the way, guided by an invisible hand. The signal intensified here, not a hum now, but a resonant thrum that vibrated through my bones. It was a symphony of alien concepts, bypassing the auditory nerve entirely and flooding my consciousness directly. It wasn't language, not in any sense I understood. It was a raw, unmediated influx of pure knowing, a cascade of understanding that rewrote the very grammar of my existence. I stepped into the cave, the roar of the ocean amplifying, distorting, becoming a voice. The air inside was thick with brine and the smell of damp earth, but also something else, something sharp and electric, like the air before a lightning strike. I wasn't just in the cave. I was part of it, my senses merging with the damp stone and the crushing weight of the earth above. Then it happened. It poured into my mind, not as information, but as a boundless, indifferent consciousness. My perception of myself fractured, and the dream, I understood with a clarity that shredded my very soul, was fragile. It could be dispelled, or worse, it could be consumed. Humanity, My humanity was not a grand narrative, but a fleeting, insignificant dream, or perhaps a fleeting, insignificant meal. I felt myself being tasted, sampled, a tiny, vibrant flavor on a cosmic palate. It wasn't malevolent, not truly. It was simply the nature of this entity, as a predator perceives its prey, with a detached, clinical appreciation of its momentary existence. A wave of nausea washed over me, not from the putrid air, but from the unbearable truth of it. My sense of self, painstakingly constructed over decades, disintegrated. I was a construct, an ephemeral projection, and the architect of this dream was now awake, its gaze upon me. Its gaze was not cruel nor kind, but utterly terrifyingly indifferent. It simply was, and I was merely a fleeting thought in its boundless, consuming awareness. I was being absorbed, yet the air, charged moments before with the scent of something like ozone and distant, wet earth, now felt thin, stretched, as if reality itself had exhaled. My fingers, still hovering over the keyboard, trembled. This was not a glitch. This was not fatigue. This was a crack in the fundamental glass of perception. I stared at the blank screen, then at my own reflection, a stranger with wide, frantic eyes staring back from the dark mirror of the glass. My skin felt too tight, a membrane stretched over something not entirely me. I needed to explain. The urgency was a cold claw in my chest, a desperate need to anchor myself to shared understanding before the current pulled me under completely. The first person I sought was a colleague, a fellow researcher known for his calm intellect, his steady, unwavering gaze. I found him in the break room, stirring sugar into a mug of lukewarm coffee. It's a pressure. It's changing the geometry of observation. The bezel, it bent. His brow furrowed, a slow, deliberate crease. "Blake, are you all right? You look exhausted." And that's not how physics works, you know. The known universe is a membrane, and something is pressing from the other side. His eyes, usually so clear, now held a shade of concern that bordered on alarm. "Blake, perhaps you should take a few days. You've been working too hard. This signal, it's clearly gotten to you. Overwork can do strange things to the mind." His gaze flickered past my shoulder, a subtle signal for me to leave, to retreat. The air around him seemed to thicken, a viscous, invisible wall rising between us. He didn't see. He couldn't. I retreated, the break room's fluorescent glow now a mocking, sickly yellow. The feeling of isolation intensified, a physical ache. I tried another, a friend from my university days, someone who had once shared late-night debates about impossible theories. I called him, my voice hoarse, the words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed torrent. "The patterns!" I gasped into the receiver, pacing my cramped apartment, the walls seeming to breathe with my agitation. They're not just data, they're a language of unmaking. I see the edges fraying. The sky outside, it's not blue anymore, not truly. Then, my friend's voice, carefully measured. Too calm. "Blake, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you feeling well? Have you slept? You sound distressed." The familiar warmth in his tone had vanished, replaced by a brittle professional distance. "Perhaps you should seek some quiet time. Get away from your work for a bit." "Quiet time?" I laughed, a harsh, unfamiliar sound. "The quiet is the loudest thing of all. It's coming for me, don't you see? It's already here, inside the words I speak, inside the very light I see." The line went dead. He had hung up. I stood there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone, a flat mechanical whine that seemed to mock the vibrant, terrible symphony playing in my head. They couldn't hear it. They couldn't see it. I was alone. A place. A memory of a place. both ancient and forgotten, where the land met the ocean in a grinding primal embrace. The coastal caves. It was where the world broke apart, where the veil was thinnest. The wind shrieked, tearing at my coat, carrying with it the scent of brine and decaying life. The path descended sharply, a treacherous ribbon of mud and loose stone, leading down to the jagged maw of the coastline. The roar of the ocean outside was muffled here, transmuted into a deep, guttural sigh. Water dripped from the unseen ceiling, each drop echoing like a distant bell. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating walls encrusted with barnacles and strange, slick growths. The rock formations twisted into impossible shapes, like frozen screams. This was where the world ended, and something else began. My mind, a fractured kaleidoscope, was suddenly clear on this one point. It was where the water had carved the rock into a perfect, unnerving spiral. A vortex of stone. It was here. It had always been here. And it was waiting for me. The signal hadn't just been reaching out. It had been reeling me in, drawing me to this precise, desolate point where its true nature could be unveiled. Not to the world, but to me. I was not deciphering a mystery. I was being consumed by one. And no one would ever know. No one could ever understand. I was its solitary, delicious feast. They were gone, vanished behind the veil woven by the signal, leaving me to the cacophony and the growing, terrible certainty that I was its sole audience. The symphony in my head, once a chaotic maelstrom, had begun to resolve into a terrifying, purposeful melody. It pulled at me, a relentless current in the depths of my being, towards the salt-laced air and the ceaseless roar of the ocean. My car, a forgotten relic of mundane existence, carried me with an unnerving autonomy. My hands gripped the wheel, but the route felt preordained, each turn a foregone conclusion. The coastal road unwound beneath the tires like a ribbon of fate, the familiar landscape warped by the signal's insidious influence. Trees stretched their branches into skeletal fingers, clawing at a sky the color of bruised plums. I could feel the pull intensify as the cliffs loomed, their ancient faces carved by wind and water, whispering of depths and forgotten things. I parked haphazardly, the vehicle a silent, abandoned husk. The entrance to the coastal caves yawned before me, a jagged maw in the cliff face. It wasn't an invitation, but an absolute command. Every nerve ending in my body vibrated with the signal, a resonance that promised answers, or perhaps an ending. Inside, the world compressed. The air grew damp and cool, smelling of wet stone and decay. Phosphorescent patches clung to the cave ceiling, casting an ethereal, sickly green glow on the rough-hewn rock, illuminating intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe with my gaze. Were they natural formations? Or had the signal etched them there, a prelude to its grand design? My feet moved without conscious direction, guided deeper into the earth's maw. Water dripped from unseen crevices, each drop a percussive note in the growing symphony. Then I stopped, and on its surface, faint at first, then coalescing with terrifying clarity, I saw them. Not symbols, not equations, but blueprints. Intricate, impossibly complex designs that seemed to weave and unweave themselves from the very fabric of the stone. They were not human, not of this world, yet my mind, against its will, began to comprehend their purpose. It was not a consumption, not merely a devouring of my consciousness, but a repurposing. My mind, my very being, was being rewired, recalibrated. I was not a meal. I was a component. The signal had not just been transmitting information, it had been transmitting instructions. My brain, once a vessel for thought and memory, was becoming a conduit, a living processor for an incomprehensible cosmic engineering project. The entity's ultimate intention was not to eradicate me, but to integrate me. I was becoming an extension, A living lens, a biological circuit board in something vast and terrible, something that was building. The patterns on the altar pulsed, and I felt my own neural pathways mimicking their impossible complexity. My hands, trembling, lifted, and I saw them begin to trace the air, mimicking the ethereal lines. It was not me moving them. It was the signal, guiding, instructing. I saw glimpses of it then. Structures that dwarfed galaxies, geometries that defied perception, a vast interwoven tapestry of existence being restitched. And I was a single thread, being pulled, twisted, and woven into its fabric. My memories, my identity, my very self were not being erased, but subsumed, recycled, becoming fuel for a grander, more alien purpose. I was not losing my mind. I was losing my mind, surrendering it to become its mind. The horror was not in the death of self, but in its forced, agonizing transformation into something utterly alien, yet still, agonizingly, me. I was becoming a part of the monstrous, a living instrument for its incomprehensible will, and the determination that had once fueled my search, now twisted into a terrible, unwavering resolve to complete the work. The symphony in my head, once a chaotic maelstrom, had become a single resonant chord, a note of such profound, terrible purity that it thrummed in my very bones. The world outside my window, the world I had once known, felt thin. A painted scrim against an abyss I now perceived with agonizing clarity. They were gone. The echoes of human connection vanished behind the veil woven by the signal, leaving me to the cacophony and the growing, terrible certainty that I was its sole audience. A relentless pull, cold and ancient, tugged at the frayed edges of my consciousness. It wasn't a thought, nor an impulse, but a fundamental directive, a magnetic north for a compass that had long ceased to point to anything familiar. I found myself walking, not by choice, but by a surrender so complete it felt like dissolution. The familiar streets blurred, houses receding into indistinct blurs of color, the air tasting of salt and something else, something metallic and vast, like the scent of creation and uncreation mingled. The path dwindled to a narrow track, winding through gnarled, wind-sculpted trees, their branches clawing at a sky that seemed unnaturally wide, bruised with an alien purple. The roar of the ocean grew, a primordial breath, a sound that no longer felt like water against rock, but something far more elemental, a gnawing, grinding force. My feet, unbidden, carried me down a steep, rocky incline, where the air grew heavy with brine and the damp, earthy smell of ancient stone. Water dripped from unseen stalactites, each drop echoing with a resonance that wasn't sound, but pure, vibrational information. My breath hitched in my throat, a futile attempt to hold on to the last vestiges of my own air. The walls, slick with algae and sea spray, seemed to breathe, their contours shifting, revealing fleeting patterns in the phosphorescent moss that clung to them. Patterns that mirrored the impossible geometries I had seen in the signal's raw data. Deeper I went, the light from the cave mouth a receding memory. I saw it then, not with my eyes, but with a deeper, more terrible faculty that had been forcefully awakened. Not consumption as we understood it. A creature eating another, a fire devouring wood, but a cosmic process, an infinitely slow, infinitely vast digestion of reality itself. Galaxies were not born and dying. They were stages in an endless, indifferent process of being metabolized. Stars were fleeting sparks, their energy not wasted, but reabsorbed, repurposed. Consciousness, human or otherwise, was a momentary flicker, a transient eddy in the grand current of this cosmic ingestion. We were not observers, nor participants in a grand design. Our lives, our loves, our struggles, our very concept of meaning, all were ephemeral vibrations within a larger pattern that saw no distinction between a thought and a star, between a human heart and a collapsing nebula. Everything existed to be perceived, and in that perception, consumed. My mind, once a fortress of scientific certainty, buckled and tore. The intricate scaffolding of physics, the comforting laws that governed the universe, dissolved into meaningless dust. Time ceased to be linear. Space became a pliable membrane. I was no longer Blake, the astrophysicist, but a single terrified cell in a colossal, indifferent organism, feeling the slow, inexorable pull towards its own reabsorption. My past, my future, my very identity, all became transparent, fragile illusions. A raw, primal scream tore through my throat, but it was soundless in the vastness, swallowed by the pervasive hum of the signal. The air pressed in, no longer just a physical weight, but a crushing awareness of my utter insignificance, my complete and total vulnerability. I was already consumed, I realized, not in body, but in mind, in spirit, in every fiber of my fractured understanding. The signal was not just information, it was the entity itself, slowly, patiently, utterly devouring my world, my sanity, and ultimately, me. And I, its sole audience, was now its final, most intimate morsel. Each brick in my neighbor's wall seemed to pulse with a hidden geometry, a fractal echo of the vast, indifferent consciousness that had, piece by piece, claimed the interior landscape of my mind. A strange, undeniable urge had seized me, a compulsion that felt both alien and utterly mine. It pulled me towards the coast, towards the gnawing edge of the land where the ocean carved its relentless scars into the rock. I walked, a puppet on invisible strings, through streets that warped and stretched with each step, the air thick with an unspoken hum that only I could hear. The streetlights bled into one another, forming elongated blurs, and the distant drone of traffic became a low, guttural chant in my ears. My own limbs felt distant, animated by a will that was no longer exclusively my own. There was a cold, oceanic certainty to this path, a sense of an ending already written. The wind off the sea was a raw, salt-laced whip, but I felt little of its bite. My senses were a fractured mirror, reflecting only the entity's vastness. The air grew heavy here, damp and ancient, smelling of brine and decay, a perfect crucible for the final merging. The rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks outside was not just sound, but a deep, resonant pulse. A slow, deliberate breath. This was where it wanted me. This was where the final transmission would be. I stumbled deeper into the cavern, the uneven floor slick beneath my worn shoes. They felt like ancient bones, calcified and patient. Water dripped from the ceiling, each splash echoing with an impossible resonance, as if 1,000 unseen drops were falling in perfect, terrible synchronicity. A desperate, furious spark ignited within me, a last, defiant flicker of the Blake I once was. It was a searing pain, a rejection of this encroaching dissolution. I had to fight. I had to send a warning, even if it was just a whisper into the void, a final, futile cry against the encroaching tide. I reached into the satchel I had by some lingering instinct, carried with me. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the effort of resistance against the entity's subtle, pervasive control. It did not want me to do this. My breath hitched. The device felt heavy, impossibly so, as if it were carved from solid lead. My fingers fumbled with the controls, each button press an act of monumental defiance. The cave walls seemed to shift, their ancient faces distorting into leering, impossible geometries. No, I rasped, the word a raw, tearing sound in my throat. Not all of me. I focused, pouring every ounce of my fading self into the single, desperate act. My fingers, stiff and clumsy, managed to activate the device. It was a frequency I had painstakingly isolated, a carrier wave designed to cut through the cosmic static, a final, desperate message. But as the indicator lights on the device flickered, a new sensation overwhelmed me. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from an internal shifting, a recalibration of my very perception. The cave walls began to ripple, not as stone, but as raw, unformed thought. The air itself seemed to shimmer, parting to reveal not rock, but a glimpse of the entity's true form. Not a shape, but a concept, a vast, hungry indifference that stretched beyond the boundaries of comprehension. My body began to change. I felt it, not as pain, but as an unraveling, a reweaving. My skin prickled, then stretched, becoming taut and glassy. My bones seemed to soften, then reform into something elongated, alien. The desperate scream that tore from my throat was not mine. Not entirely. It was a chorus, a merging of my fading consciousness with the entity's vast, consuming presence. The device itself began to fuse with my flesh, its metallic casing flowing into my transforming hand, becoming one with the new, monstrous form I was becoming. The final transmission, if it was ever sent, was not of my design. It was a burst of raw, unfiltered thought, a chaotic symphony of Blake's dying consciousness and the entity's triumphant absorption. It was not a warning. It was a hunger. It was the sound of a universe devouring its own dream. The cave, once a refuge, became a womb, and I, its unwilling, dissolving birth. My eyes, now multifaceted and obsidian, saw the world not as it was, but as a vast, edible tapestry, shimmering with infinite, delicious data. My voice, if I still possessed one, was a resonant hum, a single, terrible chord, perfectly aligned with the entity's own eternal song. I was no longer Blake. I was the signal. I was the transmission. The low, electronic whine, birthed from my desperate device, did not oppose the entity's silent thrum. It resonated with it. It was not a shield, but a tuning fork, struck in the hollow chamber of the coastal caves, finding an impossible harmonic. My fingers, still trembling from the effort, lost their grip on the cold metal casing. The device fell with a clatter, its insistent song growing louder, deeper, until the very air vibrated around me. The thrum, which had always been an internal pressure, a subtle hum behind my eyes, now swelled. It was no longer silent. It was a roar without sound, a wave of pure information crashing against the fragile shore of my mind. The whine from the device, instead of drowning it out, seemed to translate it, to give it form, to make its alien symphony comprehensible, and thus, infinitely more terrifying. My vision fractured. The rough, salt-dampened walls of the coastal caves began to breathe, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the unseen tide. The pooled water on the cave floor, reflecting the dim light from my headlamp, swirled with colors that did not exist on any spectrum I knew. Hues of absence and impossible presence. I saw not just reflections, but portals, stretching into geometries that defied Euclidean space, twisting inwards upon themselves like a collapsing star. A profound cold seeped into my bones, not from the cave's chill, but from within. My determination, once a burning ember, flickered and threatened to extinguish. What was I fighting? Not a thing, but a concept. Not an enemy, but an inevitability. The signal was no longer merely altering my perception. It was becoming my perception. My thoughts, once my own, began to echo with alien cadences, ancient and vast. I tried to anchor myself, to recall my name, my work, the simple, solid facts of my existence. But each memory was a pebble dropped into an infinite ocean, sinking without a trace. My skin prickled, then burned. It felt as though I was being unstitched, thread by invisible thread. My hands, when I looked at them, seemed to waver, their outlines blurring, becoming permeable. It was a word without weight, a plea lost in the cosmic gale. I could feel the boundaries of myself dissolving, not into nothingness, but into everything. The device, humming its relentless tune, was not a weapon against the signal, but a conduit for it. My last act had not been one of defiance, but of surrender, of opening the final gate. The entity's thrum, now interwoven with the device's whine, coursed through me. It was not a destructive force, not a crushing weight, but an assimilation. Humanity, my own consciousness, was not a meal to be devoured, but a dream to be absorbed, a ripple in its eternal slumber. And the reveal, the horrifying truth, blossomed in the collapsing garden of my mind. The signal was not a broadcast from something, but the very fabric of that something. And now, through my desperate act, I was becoming a part of that fabric. My awareness was stretching, thinning, expanding beyond the confines of my skull, beyond the coastal caves, beyond the world. My body, what remained of its sensation, collapsed. My eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the impossible geometry of the cave ceiling. My breath hitched, a final futile struggle against the tide. I was no longer Blake, the astrophysicist. I was a frequency, a resonance, an echo in the greater hum. My individual consciousness, once so fiercely guarded, was a droplet merging with an ocean, losing its distinct form, yet becoming an infinitesimal part of the whole. The device, its purpose fulfilled, sputtered. Its whine softened, then faded, leaving behind only the rhythmic surge of the ocean against the cave mouth. But the thrum, the silent, omnipresent thrum, lingered. It no longer came from some distant source. It emanated from within the coastal caves, a new subtle vibration in the very stone, in the churning water, in the salt-laden air. The world outside remained oblivious, turning on its axis, oblivious to the subtle shift in the weave of reality. The horror had not ended. It had merely begun. A new, unsettling resonance in the silent, echoing coastal caves, waiting for the next ear to attune to its unfathomable song.